Hello, everyone, and welcome to the online training of trainers for Introduction to Restorative Practices and Using Circles Effectively. My name is Beth Small. I am a lecturer on the faculty here at the IIRP Graduate School, and I'm going to spend a little time with you familiarizing you with the curriculum for both of the training events that you're here to learn to deliver, as well as the slides. So when you log on to your training, you will be spending time with your instructor, going through the simulations and deciding who's going to prepare and deliver which simulation. What I will be doing throughout this video is just giving you an overview of the curriculum itself, sharing some tips that I think may be helpful as you are preparing for your simulation, and just to, again, kind of show you the slides and give you a bit of an overview. So what you have downloaded so far from the landing page is a partial curriculum and the training slides with a watermark on them. So once you've completed the training, you will receive the link to get the full curriculum, which gives the table of contents, all of the curriculum maps and learning objectives, which you will also go through during your training, as well as the videos for the events, some tips to delivering the content online, and several other pieces that will be included in the full curriculum. So again, your instructor will review all of that with you, and you will have access to all of that once you have completed the training. What I'm going to share with you today, again, is that partial curriculum. It's what you have access to now, and it will give you, again, all of the information that you need to prepare for the online training. So this is the partial curriculum for Introduction to Restorative Practices. And again, when you receive the full curriculum, there will be a table of contents that will direct you to certain pages, and all of that will be live links. So again, you'll get that at the end of your training time together. This first part here just gives a little bit of a disclaimer, if you will. So these trainings have been designed to be for one full day of learning, or 6 hours of direct instruction. So for Introduction to Restorative Practices, 1 full day, and Using Circles Effectively, 1 full day. We realize under the time constraints that we have and our schedules, it may not be possible to deliver all of this content in full days in person. So again, you will explore this throughout your training, and you will get access to the curriculum maps, and which include the learning objectives, so that you will have some flexibility to modularize the event and also deliver the materials online. So you will get all of that information throughout your training, and you'll have access at the end. So in the curriculum, you'll have the full day agenda, and then I just want to start to show you how this is structured. So for each section, there will be some objectives, and sometimes they're specifically for you as the trainer, and sometimes they're learning objectives, excuse me, for the event, along with just some checklists and some things for you to consider as you're preparing. So, and then there's corresponding slides that you'll see here in the curriculum, and then also in the actual slide deck. So these will correspond throughout as you go through. So for the first section here, really it's just the registration. It's an opportunity for folks to be welcomed as they're coming into the event. We do encourage folks to purchase the books, the green book and the blue book that you would have received during your training. There's book excerpts that you will receive to send, especially if you're doing this event online. But there's a lot of references to those books in these training materials. So you'll also notice as you dig in, the way that this is structured is that when there's activities, they'll be bolded. These are just, again, suggestions. These are things that we've done time and time again that have worked really well. So in the beginning, bringing everyone together, we would encourage you to set the room in a circle so that everyone has the opportunity to initially get connected. There's an opportunity for an open and go around, so everyone's voice can be heard early on. We also talk about creating agreements and norms and expectations. that the group can come up with collectively to be able to set the tone for the day or series of events if you are breaking this down into something smaller. We also encourage you to talk about your influence in this work and kind of what brought you to this work. We'll share a little bit in the curriculum about the IIRP's entry into this work and the Indigenous history of this work. If it makes sense where you're at, we would encourage you to do a land acknowledgement in a way that makes sense for your community that you're working with. So that's in this shaded box here. So you'll notice this as well throughout the training, throughout the curriculum, there are these little shaded boxes that will give little tips and notes. Then we move into the learning outcomes, which again, there's a corresponding slide every time it's here in the curriculum. You'll also see it here in the slide deck. So you'll be able to match those things together. And we think it's important to let folks know what they're going to be experiencing over our time together. And then we have an optional video to start the day. So again, you'll have access to this throughout the training, but this was a video that San Francisco Unified School District put together about their own journey and experience with introduction to bringing restorative practices to their setting. Then we move into a reflection. Again, this is an opportunity for individuals to reflect on their current practice. So again, you'll see this learning objective here. And then you can, kind of do these activities however you think works for you, right? So when I do the reflection, I usually give people an opportunity to do a little parent share out, what they thought was something that struck them or resonated with them. I like very early on in training to get people up and moving. So I may even say, stand up and find a partner you haven't, chatted with yet, or that you don't know very well, and talk about which of these quotes really that you connect with or that you resonate with. And then, you can kind of share that back. So again, in the activity, they'll give you some of these examples and what I'm sharing now, and then also you have the freedom and the flexibility to really create this and make this your own. Then we move into another activity around context. So this activity really is about setting the stage for whatever context you're in. So if you're working in an elementary school, secondary, higher ed, if you're working in a nonprofit, really gives the participants an opportunity to start to explore what's our context, what are we working with, what are some of the challenges that we experience. There are several slides here because you can kind of do this in several different ways. You can do one question at a time. You can put all the questions up at once. One thing I like to do is to put the first maybe 4 questions up, or and have people pair up, or you could do each question separately and have folks rotate each time. So again, lots of variety that you can do with the training here. And if you're doing this online, you can certainly use small breakout rooms to simulate a little of those smaller group conversations. But what we're really landing on at the end of this activity is the importance of relationships, right? And how relationships really do set the stage for our work with young people, for our work with each other and families, whatever our context is. And that often is what makes the difference in people's lives, right? Or the connections that we've had. So you'll notice here another tip. This is an opportunity for you to share a story that shows the connection between relationships and positive changes. So again, you'll see these shaded boxes. You'll see tips like this where we'll encourage you to share stories throughout the event. That's really what makes this training come alive. And what makes this training different from one person to the next, right, of who's delivering it. So my training will be influenced by my stories, and your training will be influenced by yours. So use your training opportunity to flesh out your stories, to explore them, to learn from other stories, and also add those to your repertoire. So after that section, we move into where we start to really hone in and talk about explicit practice. So again, here you'll notice the shaded boxes, trainer objectives, learning objectives. And again, every time there's a slide, like there is here, slide 11, we can flip back to the slide deck and it'll be right there with you. So you'll be able to kind of have the slide in front of you in the curriculum that matches, again, the slides that will be up on the screen. So in this section, we're really starting to unpack and explore the why behind our practice, right? Why do we do what we do? And we unfold this in a way to help folks understand, or just maybe even come to some of the realization that sometimes we just do what we do because we know what we're doing, right? We haven't been asked to explain our practice really clearly. I often will share some stories here again about maybe being asked about restorative practices or asked about what I do and how initially early on it was difficult for me, right? And this is about working from an implicit framework rather than an explicit framework. And what we really want to do is start to shift to a much more explicit framework and being really clear. So again, there'll be several tips in this section that will talk about, ways you communicate that. I love to cook, so I'll sometimes share a story about, recipes that I can, make something, but if I share the recipe and have everyone else make it, it might be different every time because I just kind of do what I do, right? I add a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I'm not always really explicit about, what goes into the recipe, right? And there's a value in that, but there's also, there's some challenges to that, right? When we can't be really clear and explicit about what we're communicating, especially when we're talking about restorative practices or other school-based initiatives, it's hard, or it can be hard for folks to really understand, why are we doing this? Is this just one more thing that I have to do in my already really busy day? So when we get to the section where we're, talking about the why and why it's important to be explicit, one of the things I always really focus on here is this idea of proliferation of programs. So many of you who are watching or folks that you're going to train have maybe experienced some school-based initiative fatigue or just any initiative fatigue. You may be working at a nonprofit or another organization where we're constantly doing new things. And where that can be a challenge if we're not being really clear and explicit is that we end up implementing 4 or 5 things poorly because we're not making the specific connections between one and the other, right? So let's use PBIS for an example. If you're implementing PBIS and you're implementing restorative practices, there's some really clear similarities there that if you help folks connect the dots, it doesn't feel like one more thing. It's also important to have those conversations about where things differ a little bit so that we know, we can be certain about our practice, right? And know, what to do when we're doing it. So really this whole section just gets us to the point where we can start to be really clear and explicit about restorative practices. So that brings into our fundamental hypothesis, right? And the aim of restorative practices, which is really our why, right? Why we do what we do. This is also the first time you'll start to stress the importance of the 80-20 rule, right? Which is doing 80% of our interactions should be proactive, so that we've built that social capital and laid the groundwork for when we do need to respond to wrongdoing or harm. So again, you'll see these shaded boxes. I can't stress it enough. Take a look at these, take note of these, so that when you are, exploring your, preparing your simulations and exploring, different ideas, the tip section will really be helpful. So then we move into an activity where we'll start to get really clear about relationships in communities. We believe that relationships are certainly the cornerstone of this work, but we also know that not everyone is as comfortable building relationships and connections as others may be, right? So this activity gives us an opportunity to first identify what do appropriate and healthy relationships look like, sound like, feel like, and then what can get in the way. And then ultimately, how do we overcome those barriers? One of the things that often comes up in this section as far as barriers and what can get in the way is bias, right? Implicit bias, explicit bias. So while this is not a training around bias, it's important to have those conversations at the same time, right? Because if restorative practices is the science of relationship and community, and we know that bias can get in the way of that, then it's something we have to explore and take on kind of in conjunction with. So this is one of those opportunities to start to have that conversation. Again, being really explicit about how we can use this work to have some of those more difficult conversations. Then there's an opportunity for your first break. And then when we come back, we start to dig into the social discipline window. So again, if you're doing this online, and I know you'll talk more about this in your training, Most of the teaching sections would be done in videos ahead of time, right? So that when you do come online, you'll just kind of jump right into the activity. So you will have access to videos about the social discipline window. You may want to create your own for your own context so that your folks can see you as the trainer. And there may be a connection there that'll help them, with the material. So again, you'll notice learning objectives, and then we do have the activities here. So in this first activity, we typically do it as a go around, right? Getting people to think about from their own setting, people who've been restorative with them, right? So think about the person who had the greatest impact on you, someone you respected the most. And then you get those one-word answers. And what we ultimately get is this empty social discipline window, right? With the axes of low to high on control and then support, right? So sometimes folks may have issue with the word control. I haven't run into it too often, but I also talk about that word as expectations and limit setting, right? We all have authority and influence, and the social discipline window gives us some options on how we exercise that authority and influence. And I think those, again, are really important conversations to have. So you can unpack this box, in a variety of different ways. I sometimes will put the social discipline window on the floor and kind of walk around and talk about different examples from my own life, my own experience that fit each of the windows. So it's completely up to you how you want to deliver this content, but there are some notes and tips that will help you do that. So once we've explored this information, the first activity is a bit of just a reflection. And again, if you're doing this online, you can do these in small breakouts. If you're doing this in person, you can just have folks, kind of get together in small groups. But this first activity is just kind of going back to that person they, were thinking about earlier. Who's the person in a position of authority that you respected the most? What was that like for you? What made it restorative? And then how do you become more purposeful in your practice? So again, sticking with that theme of explicit practice and really being clear about our why. And then once we're done with this, we get into a bit of the practitioner styles, right? So you can do this again as 4 corners of the room. If you're online, you can do a poll or you can do annotations. But these are just, some quick examples, and you could change these, of course. But what window would you be in if someone said, sit down and shut up? Everyone will hopefully go to the 2 box. And again, just use these as a quick energizer. And then we get into another activity where we start to take a look at what happens when practitioners are spending an overwhelming majority of their time, 95% of their time, in one of these windows, right? Punitive, permissive, neglectful, and restorative. We do the first one together just to give folks, again, the understanding of the activity. But brainstorm, what would you observe if you were a fly on the wall? And then what would the likely outcomes be? So when I do the training, I do the punitive one together, and then I break folks into smaller groups to do the other 3 and then come back and share out. So if I'm doing it online, I ask people to report in the chat. If I'm doing it live, I'll do some posters around the room so we could just simply do a gallery walk. And then after the social discipline window, we are moving into fair process. So I like to transition by saying, so we know what it means to be in the with box, right? And how to exercise our influence and authority, but how do we stay there, especially when we're making decisions? So all 3 parts of fair process kind of help us do that, right? Help us get into that with box. And there's more language in the curriculum that will support you in that and give you some more tips. You'll also see throughout the curriculum tips like reading recommendations. So these are really important because what you're seeing just in the curriculum itself is not going to be enough to for your content knowledge, right? So you're going to need to do some further reading. So take a look at these tips. There's also a reference page at the end of the curriculum that is it's not exhaustive, so there's plenty more resources out there, but we wanted to just give the list of resources that the actual training were based on. So in the fair process section, again, it's going to follow pretty similar to what we did in the social discipline window. We'll do some questioning to kind of draw out from folks about thinking of a time you felt you were treated unfairly and what that was like. What was missing, right? Ultimately to get us to these 3 E's. And then we go through the central idea and then back to the 3 E's again. So this is another opportunity for storytelling. again, to give people just a good understanding of what this is and how this would work in practice. And then what fair process is in and what it achieves. So there are several optional activities for fair process. So there's 3 different activities here that you could do in some small groups, and you can certainly create your own as well. But I try to do, depending on time, maybe a quick reflection as far as like what works really, what part of fair process comes really naturally and easy, and what's a little bit more difficult, or also thinking of a decision that you're contemplating, and then how could you use fair process to make that decision. And then the last part here before we would break for lunch is the organizational change window. So this, again, it's a social discipline window again, but how do we use influence and authority to bring about a change? So again, there's these 4 different ways, and we believe the WIC box certainly is the way to do that. And you also may want to connect this to whole school change, right? And bringing about this practice. So then we move on to lunch, come back, icebreaker, and then move into psychology of affect and the compass of shame. There is, again, another of several resources that I think are really important to take a look at and dig into. They're going to be in this document as well. One of the books that I've often recommended is called The Psychology of Emotion and Restorative Practices. That's edited by Kelly and Thorsborn. It's an excellent guide to this theory and practice. It takes you through schools, organizations, criminal juvenile justice, and just some really good overview primer of the theory. So oftentimes, folks have never heard of Sylvan Tompkins before. So I often will say, we're gonna talk about affect, feeling, and emotion a little bit differently, or we're gonna explore shame a little bit differently. You can certainly make connections to Brene Brown's work. I've been doing that more and more. There's also some tips in the curriculum as to where and how to do that. But what we're ultimately getting at here is to just give a very brief overview of this theory and really focusing in, zeroing in on shame. And this tip here, I do this all the time. I'll write the word shame and ask people to respond to the word, what comes to mind, what does this bring up for folks? And there's always a lot of negative things, but then there's always some, I don't know if positive is the right word, but things as far as, well, it helps us realize when things aren't right, or it gives us an opportunity to make things better. And that really is what, why this theory gets closely connected to restorative practices, because the motivator in the shame affect is to restore. So things were good and now they're not anymore, and I just want them to be good again. It also explains, John Braithwaite, a criminologist from Australia, would talk about this, why victims of crime feel shame when they haven't done anything wrong, because Tompkins' theory is that this is an interruption or an impediment to positive affect. So again, read through the script, read through the additional resources. This is a great section to really dig into and explore the theory, and to give folks an opportunity to kind of sit with this and figure out how it fits for them. So then we move through, again, the compass of shame. There are a few activities in here. The shame activity, again, that you can, I like to do this in a triad. It just gives people an opportunity to do some reflection. This is about themselves, right? So think about a time you experienced an interruption or an impediment to positive affect. What pole of the compass did you go to? I've often followed that up too with, where do you see this in your setting, right? So how do we see the students that we're working with, or even our coworkers respond to shame? There's also an optional activity here you can do, again, to kind of split the room into different ways and ask folks to go to a certain part of the compass when, if they could relate to one of these sentence steps. All right, so then we just move through responding to shame, Braithwaite's hypothesis, which is really kind of the basis of, again, restorative practices of valuing the individual, but disapproving of behavior. So this really is where that Brene Brown connection comes into. We tend to organize this as stigmatizing shame, which pushes the person out, says what you did was not okay and who you are is not okay. Where reintegrative shame is to express disapproval, but to value the individual, right, and the person. So Brene Brown would call that shame versus guilt. So again, there are some really clear connections. And then as we continue to move on, we get to the central blueprint. I also like to tell a lot of stories here in this section. And again, the books and additional resources will certainly give you more information around that. So I would just encourage you to kind of read through this and kind of get your story set. And then we move to the continuum, right? The continuum gives us the outlets, the rituals, and the processes to be able to actualize those blueprints that we just went through. So on this first slide, you're not going to spend a whole lot of time here because as you go through the rest of the slides in the curriculum, there'll be individual slides for affective statements, questions, and small impromptu conversations. So you'll just do a quick overview here and then dig in for each section. So each section, there'll be a slide. Let me just get to that part where you'll go through the activities. So there'll be a little bit more information and then some activities that you can do. So you can do the ones we've suggested, you can come up with your own. But in this simulation, there's a lot of just kind of setting up the activities and bringing folks back. And then just kind of move us through quickly here towards the end. So if you are doing this training as a full day of intro and then circles the next day, you won't spend too much time on circles at all here. You'll save all of that for the next day. But if you are not, you may want to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about circles and just giving a few more examples of that throughout your day. And then it's your final consolidation and checkout. So again, here are those references that I talked about, and they're here. And then there's again plenty of these. I'm sure you'll share more in your train the trainer of swapping resources and giving getting some great recommendations and also sharing some. So that's our intro day. And then we'll move into circles. So again, for this event, you'll spend time going through all of the intros curriculum and then the circles and breaking up into simulations. So you'll notice here that the curriculum are set up identically, right? Very similar. You'll see the same things in each one. Trainer objectives are going to be the same here. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because a lot of this we've already done. So the preparation is the same. The title slide is the same. There's some notes in here that we'll talk about if you did the intro training the day before, you'll just kind of flow naturally into this. If there's time in between the two, then you may be spending a little bit more time doing reviews or just resetting the stage, doing agreements again. And there is time built in for that. So no worries there. So again, this beginning part would be done the same way that I already explained it. And if you're coming back to day 2, you'll just review some things quickly. We start again with learning outcomes. There's 2 slides for quotes for folks to just kind of get connected to the material. And then we start with a review of the social discipline window and the continuum. So again, if you're doing this the next day, this will be a little bit shorter. If you're doing this with maybe a month or 2 in between, you'll spend a little bit more time here. There's a couple different optional activities that we've included, but feel free to reteach this information in any way that you see fit, right? So the only real note on this section is don't teach and do the same activities that you did on the first training, right? So to mix it up a little bit to give folks a different experience. And then after that review, there is an optional video that you can show. It's called A Story About Restorative Practices in Schools. It talks about a bullying situation where the headmaster of the school talks about using the informal side of the continuum, so affective statements and questions, which ultimately led to a small impromptu conversation to move through the process. So this is an optional video. Again, if you think it's something that would be helpful, we encourage you to show it. I like it because it kind of tightens up that informal part of the continuum as we move into circles and the more formal end of things. So it's kind of just a nice, I think, comma, right, of the curriculum. And then we're jumping into circles. So again, if you're doing this online, it would be a little bit different. You would have folks maybe view these circle clips ahead of time. I review this section and tell some stories here and then get into the video clips. So there's 6 different clips you can show. I tend to show 2 or 3 just as an opportunity for folks to really take a look at what are the critical issues that they see, what would they ask next. As this tip explains, I tend to chart on poster board the questions that are being asked so that you really can look at these almost as a little mini case study and say, well, what would you ask next? What did you think about the questions? So again, pay attention to those tip sections as you go through. And then after that, you'll notice there's a circle demonstration. There's this, we try to infuse quick circles throughout this day. And then every time we do a circle in the circles day, we talk a little bit about why. Why would we spend 10 minutes or why would we spend 3 minutes to do this quick circle? So it just, again, helps us start to think about those critical issues, what it is that we're trying to achieve through this process. Oh, and I also failed to mention the slides. So there's also going to be slides that will match this curriculum as well, and you'll have access to those initially. And then this is the one section of the training that is a little bit of a little teaching and lecture. And again, if you're doing this online, you would either use the video we've provided or do your own video to explain these next several slides. And again, I'll go through this really quickly. It's just an opportunity, again, for some storytelling to give some real specific examples of what this concept is all about. And then we move into circle lesson planning. This is, I think, one of my favorite activities. So it gives us an opportunity to really start to explore what kind of questions would we ask, what type of circles do we want to bring back to our settings, and then have some real specific concrete takeaways from the event. So this activity is in 2 parts, and there's a lot of directions here. So again, if you're doing this as your simulation or when you are doing this in training, you're going to want to read through and just kind of wrap your head around the activity. So the first part is to do a brainstorm of all the different topics that you could run circles for. And we tend to break this into 3 different scenarios. So for students, for staff, and maybe for community or parents, some things will be the same throughout and some will be specific to these different groups, right? So then once you have these lists, and we've given you plenty of examples in here, then we break into some smaller groups, and we sometimes work in affinity groups around roles. So maybe teachers working together, administrators, counselors, so that they can pick scenarios that are going to be really relevant to their situation. And then in the circle lesson planning, there's a handout that goes along with this that you have access to. It'll also be in the curriculum. There's a fillable version. If you're doing it online, you could use the fillable version. And it just brings us through how to create the topic, what type of circle, the goal, being really specific about the goal, and then the circle questions. And we've included 2 examples so that the participants see what the finished product is supposed to look like. So make sure that you're reviewing those, and you even may want to pick a topic and do it all together as a group. One of the key pieces in this is using that affective statement format of past, present, and future. I'll often say, even if you have 3 questions on your circle lesson plan, something that starts in the past, brings to the present, to the future, right? So where were we, where are we, and where are we going? And then after this, we have lunch. We come back for an energizer. There's an next activities about rituals. So I break folks into small groups, ask for a facilitator. So this is, again, where people can kind of practice facilitating and then run through this circle and do the debrief. A couple things that I like to just highlight in the ritual debrief is that first, this is really a circle about implementation. And I also sometimes will ask, did anyone, when you talked about defining ritual, was there any negative connotation that came up? The reason I ask that is because sometimes circles become a negative, right? Sometimes circles become that thing we do when things are going wrong and we miss the community building piece. So it's just as a nice reminder that even, even with our best intentions, if we're not really being, again, paying attention to what our goal is and why are we doing this, sometimes things can get lost. And then this next part here is an option. You have some options. So you can do another round of circle lesson planning. You can do, there's going to be in your full curriculum some other just circle activities that you can choose from. You could use the general conflict script and talk about using circles to respond to harm and wrongdoing and conflict. So a lot of options here as well for the second round of circle lesson planning. And then you're moving into using circles for more serious situations. This has probably already come up. throughout the day. So this is just an opportunity to talk a little bit about that. There is, again, a short video and an article that you'll have access to after the training that will just give us an opportunity to talk a little bit about this topic. I'll often say that circles aren't necessarily therapy, especially in our school settings, but they can be therapeutic, right? And they can be used to process difficult situations. And then lastly, we talk about using circles with staff and using a fishbowl to demonstrate restorative problem solving. So if you are doing this online, the way we've kind of simulated a fishbowl is to have that inner circle represented by folks keeping their cameras on, and then the outer circle turns their cameras off until they're ready to share, and then they'll turn their camera on to do that, to give the feedback. So that's worked out really well, and I'm sure you'll talk a lot more about that during your TOT. And then after this, we just start to wrap up. So I like to take the time for some final questions, doing a closing circle. It also says evaluation. You may want to create an evaluation. That's completely up to you. And then there's lastly a reference page here as well. So I hope you're not feeling too overwhelmed at the end of this video, but realize I just went through 2 days of training in about 45 minutes. So it was a lot of information, really smushed into a short amount of time. But it's really just to give you some tips and some ideas as you're preparing for your simulations. Again, when you log on, your instructor will give you a lot more information. And after each simulation is delivered, you'll spend some time in the debrief and talking about some things that worked, and getting some feedback about ways to improve. So enjoy your event. I hope that you have a great time and make some wonderful connections. I'd also, again, encourage you to share resources with each other. There's so many wonderful books and videos and articles out there that can certainly support your training and give you some great tips along the way. So thank you for listening. And I hope that our paths cross at some point. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.